Welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome people to this event, which is co-sponsored by the Catholic Chaplaincy to London Universities, the University Jewish Chaplaincy, and the Anscombe Bioethics Centre, which is the National Bioethics Centre for the Catholic Church in the United Kingdom and Ireland. My name is Professor David Albert Jones, and I am the director of the Anscombe Centre. So that's my role here. The title we've given this event is Assisted Dying, Eugenics, Euthanasia and Medicine. It's an event for Interfaith Week, which is Interfaith Week in universities, but it's not just a faith issue, it affects everyone. However, the abuses of eugenics have had an impact on religious minorities in the past, most especially through the horrors of Nazi medicine. And our hope in making this topic an interfaith discussion is that it can help illuminate the debate over assisted dying in a way that contributes to the common good of society, for those of all faiths and none. This topic looks back and forward, back to the past and forward to the future, because to look to the future, it is necessary to acknowledge our past. And historically, there has been an important link between what has come to be called assisted dying, that is euthanasia and assisted suicide, and the idea of eugenics, that is the idea of improving the health of the population by preventing diseases that are genetically inherited. It's not so much that allowing euthanasia necessarily leads people to be regarded as less worthy of life. Historically speaking, it's rather the other way around. It was first the eugenics movement, which began what G.K. Chesterton called a war upon the weak, the characterizing of people who were sick as a burden to society and as unworthy to breed. And it was then these same people who first embraced eugenics, who then took the further step and argued that the law should permit euthanasia for the same people, at least voluntary euthanasia. Eugenics came first, historically. Euthanasia followed. The worst excesses were in Nazi Germany, but the same ideas were popular among some doctors and academics and politicians in England and in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. For example, the founder of the organization, which is now called Dignity in Dying, but for most of its history was known as the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, was a doctor called Charles Killick Millard. He was also a prominent member of the Eugenics Society. Eugenics led to euthanasia. It might be thought that Killick Millard, mainly writing in the 1920s and 30s before the war, was simply naive, and that it would be grossly unfair to associate him with the terrible things done under Nazi eugenics and euthanasia. However, even after the war, even after the Nuremberg trials, when no one could anymore claim ignorance of these atrocities, Killick Millard was contacted by a man called Siegbert Ramsauer, a Nazi war criminal who had been a mid-ranking officer in the SS and a doctor in a concentration camp. Ramsauer was suspected of many crimes, including the use of prisoners for human experimentation, but he was convicted on 2 counts of euthanizing prisoners by injecting them with phenol. Ramsauer was an Austrian, and knowing that Killick Millard was head of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society in Britain, he wrote to him asking him to advocate for Ramsauer's early release, ostensibly on health grounds. Incredibly to me anyway, from this distance in history, Killick Millard was more than happy to do this. And he wrote to the British government on Ramsauer's behalf. For after all that he had been found guilty of were 2 counts of euthanasia, albeit involuntary, albeit of prisoners, albeit in a concentration camp. That was the 1950s, and it is part of our history. But it is still relevant to the present because discussion of assisted dying always takes place in the context of the increasing numbers of people living to a great old age and the challenge of providing adequate health and social care. In the foreground, it is all about autonomy, but in the background, the idea of being a burden is more and more prominent. Most people who die by assisted suicide in Oregon cite fear of becoming a burden as one of their reasons for ending their life. So to discuss this topic, we have three speakers. First, Rabbi Dr. Moshe Friedman, who is rabbi of the New West End Synagogue in London, Jewish chaplain to Canary Wharf Multi-Faith Chaplaincy, and a member of the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, which provides independent advice to the UK government on moral, ethical, and faith considerations in health and social care. He has a PhD in medical physics and has recently published a letter in the BMJ on religious views on assisted dying. Second, Mohammed Omar, MBE, who is chair of the Redbridge Faith Forum, is board member for external affairs at the Gardens of Peace, the largest dedicated Muslim cemetery in the United Kingdom, and is also a member of the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group. And third, Professor Daniel Sulmazy, who is director of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics with co-appointments in the departments of philosophy and of medicine at Georgetown University. He has written extensively on end-of-life ethics and is co-editor, along with Dr. Sheldon Rubenfeld, of a book, Physician-Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia, Before, During, and After the Holocaust, which was published this year. After these speakers, we will have time for discussion. And for the discussion, I'd ask you to put any questions in the chat and direct them to David Katz, who will be chairing the discussion. Professor David Katz is Emeritus Professor of Immunopathology at University College London and has provided advice within the Jewish community about medical and research issues, both scientific and ethical. And at the end, we'll have a vote of thanks from Father Philip Miller, who is the senior Catholic chaplain to the universities of the Diocese of Westminster, to the London universities. Please note that this event is being recorded, and we will be in touch with participants to know when and in what form the video will be made available. And please, can I remind you again to stay muted. So without further ado, can I invite Rabbi Dr. Moshe Friedman to speak. Thank you, Moshe.
Professor Jones, thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you for inviting me to this illustrious panel, and so wonderful to see so many people joining us this evening. I do want to touch on two separate areas today. One, the religious side of this, and one, what I will loosely term a sort of rights-based, legal, ethical side to assisted suicide. I will leave the very fascinating connections to eugenics to Professor and Sulmazy and others as well. But obviously this is a subject which is not just of a concern to us as a religious community, but touches on something that we have a particular sensitivity to. I want to start by looking at what you actually just said before, Professor Jones, about the sort of the front end of assisted suicide being one of autonomy, one of personal choice. And this is something that's important because I think it helps to frame the issue for people of a religious belief and why religious people would have something to say about this particular subject in the public square. So we don't view God merely as the creator of the world and the universe. We view God as being intimately involved in the running of the universe, and his laws reflect not just his divine will, but what is right for all humanity, not just for us. That doesn't mean that we impose our views on others. That means that we believe that his laws are absolute and immutable. Jewish ethics is derived from Jewish law. And although there are some interesting discussions to be had about the concept of natural morality, of our own perception of morality, and how that meshes into Jewish law and Jewish ethics, even though room is left for that concept of natural morality, Jewish ethics really fundamentally is based on what is written in the Torah, in the Hebrew scriptures, and is also derived by our sages in the Talmud and in the coded laws that come from the Talmud itself. Human morality does have a place, as I said, but this is only to forbid what God has permitted, not to permit what God has forbidden. The value of life, therefore, is something which is absolute and non-negotiable. It is regardless of the quality of life, however painful or pitiful it seems, it lies beyond the realm of human touch. Attempts to claim that religious text-based approval for assisted suicide, as has been published recently in the BMJ, in my mind, are contrived and rather cynical. While everything must be done to alleviate the pain of someone who is terminally ill, or in fact, not terminally ill, anyone should be given the right treatment and should be given the best treatment possible, it is forbidden in Jewish law to intentionally accelerate the death of a patient, even when they are legally competent and wish to die in order to end their suffering. This has been codified by many of our religious leaders who are involved intimately with medical law. And fundamentally, the sort of contemporary Jewish perspective on this is quite absolute, quite clear. There is absolutely no room whatsoever for any doctor, Jewish or non-Jewish, to end the life of a patient prematurely. There are, however, precedents in our literature about praying for a merciful death. One can pray for someone who is terminally ill to die, or who is suffering in pain to die, because that at least puts the responsibility squarely with God and not with us, because it is for God to decide, not for other people. Human logic may lead us to think that the person who has a hopelessly poor quality of life, who is suffering unbearably and wishes to end their life, should be the primary moral force when determining when life should end. Okay, there is a very powerful and emotive group of people who have suffered enormously, who have watched relatives suffer enormously, and we should, at the very least, show them the respect that we understand their suffering and that we are compassionate human beings. We all are. Wherever you lie on this debate, we all have compassion, we all understand. However, what we see, what we detect, is that although supporting the terminally ill emotionally and caring for them from a medical perspective is the absolute requirement, when it comes to providing this autonomy to end someone's life early, to assist someone to effectively commit suicide, this is a step way beyond what is morally acceptable in society in general. In 2006, Rabbi Sachs, Zichron Livracha, of blessed memory, quoted the late Austrian-British economist and philosopher F.A. Hayek, who notes in his book entitled The Fatal Conceit, The Errors of Socialism, that human intervention in history has often been catastrophic. Yet those who came before us were not foolish, he writes. How did they make what seems in retrospect to be disastrous decisions? Hayek's answer was the law of unintended consequences, which says that whatever you foresee as the result of your choice is only a small part of the story. Decisions have ripples of consequence no one can predict at the time. Our knowledge of the future is unlike our knowledge of the past. We can see clearly in hindsight, but in the case of the future, we can hardly see more than a few feet in front of our eyes. The legalization of physician-assisted suicide is deeply concerning. There are many hidden dangers, not least the deconsecration of life itself. The results of this can be seen fascinatingly in countries such as the Netherlands, which have some of the most liberal laws when it comes to euthanasia and assisted suicide. In a paper published in Nephrology, Dialysis, Transplant of this year, the authors detected a large increase in patient voluntary dialysis withdrawal, which accounts for the greatest cause of death among renal patients and has been steadily growing since the year 2000. The authors of this paper suggest a link between this growth and changing societal attitudes to life and the acceptability of treatment withdrawal in the Netherlands since the legalization of active euthanasia in 2001. In other words, the legalization of physician-assisted suicide has had a societal change in the very concept of life itself, of whether patients should continue treatment or simply give up. Hayek held that the simplest way of avoiding catastrophe is to keep a few simple rules that have proved their worth by ensuring the survival of cultures that kept them. There are clear dangers to a very large group of incredibly vulnerable people when it comes to assisted suicide: the elderly and infirm, the terminally ill, and those in chronic pain. These dangers are a price too large to pay for providing a benefit to a relatively small group of people. Now, one may argue that there is no place for religious views in public life, regardless of the fact that there are many non-religious perspectives and non-religious concerns when it comes to assisted suicide. However, given that we live in a secular society, we don't live in a theocracy, why should someone with religious views air their views in this way and seemingly impose their religious positions on what should be a secular debate? The question is, however, if the ethical direction of the country is simply set by human lawmakers, then at the very least, the views of religious leaders and those who hold religious views are just as important as secular voices, if not more so, given that the foundation of morality, even human morality, comes from religion itself. In case you thought this was an exercise devoid of compassion or emotion, I have had the privilege in my professional life to be present a number of times at the time of someone's death. But my first experience of this was working as an auxiliary nurse for the British Nursing Association when I was a student. I was studying medical physics and I wanted to see the sharp end of medicine. I saw terrible things. I grew up very quickly during that period. I saw patients in chronic pain asking for morphine when they already had the highest dose they were allowed. I saw the elderly and terminally ill in states of great indignity. But at no point did I seek to devalue the life that they had and think to myself that they would be better off dead. I did my best to treat and care for them until their very last breath. And I watched doctors and nurses doing exactly the same. That is the kind of country that I want to live in. A country that safeguards the weak and the vulnerable and does everything to treat them until God decides that their time has come. Thank you very much.
So could I invite Mohammed to speak second? Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to air the view. It's a personal view, but obviously it will be from my religious perspective, which I would like to deliberate on. I share very much what my compatriot Moshe has said, because very much so, our beliefs are very similar in the sense that life is so valuable and the extent of life cannot be taken by anybody else. It is stated very clearly that life, that the body that God has given an individual is not a personal possession. No one is free to dispose of their body as they wish, because it is a trust for which they will be accountable by the Creator on the day of judgment. This is the fundamental belief for the Muslim community, that our laws are prescribed by what it says in our Quran and what has been said by the 4 or 5 books, which are the scriptures, which gives the interpretation of the Quran and how we should live our life. For us, life is extremely valuable, and that there is no point that we can ask to our pray even that, God take our life earlier. What the best we can do is, God, please give me a life that is best for me. Right? And if it is best for me to live, then please give me that life. If it is best for me to die, then let that be. Once again, what even Moshe had said is exactly the same, that God owns your life. He is the one who will determine exactly what you will go through in life. And for us, is we have a full faith in God. And this is why our religious aspect of it clearly states that we cannot interfere with the life which we are being given. And therefore, assisted suicide is something which will not be permitted in our religion at all. There is no discussion on that aspect from a religious perspective at all. No matter how bad a person is feeling through. I myself have had personal experience. I have been at the forefront of so many people who have had to bury, but at the same time, I've also had so many people who have actually died in my arms because I was there at the end of life. You can well imagine that I personal experience when my mother died in October due to COVID. Once again, I could see the pain in her. She was in so much pain, as Moshe had said, she had the highest dose of morphine. But at every stage, the nurses, the doctors, and the family, at no stage would we have said that she should be taken away. This is something which is fundamentally in our beliefs. We have always been told that no matter how ill you are, there'll always be a cure God has created. And it is said that God has created a medicine for every disease except old age. This is something which we've come to expect, that at old age, we will definitely go back to our Maker. For us as a Muslim community as well, whenever somebody is terminally ill, we also believe that it is an opportunity for us to ensure that a part of our sins are actually washed away when you are in pain. It's God's way of trying to ensure that when you go to the Maker, you're going there without any sins. So for us, it's not to say that we ask to be ill, but it is also a form of a blessing for us. This is a debate which cannot be said in one respect. It has to have religious consequences. And I do not wish for 1 minute to be in a country, just like Moshe, whereby our religious beliefs are not upheld. In terms of compassion, every patient which I will see, every family which I will see, who've had to see and endure their loved ones go through this pain, we will be as compassionate as possible. Compassionate is something which is fundamental in our particular religion. Our religion very clearly states there are 5 major principles from Islamic law: the preservation of the protection of religion, protection of self, including life and honor, protection of the progeny and family, protection of the intellect, and protection of the property. It is said that preservation of life takes precedence over preservation of wealth. So you can imagine how much value we give to life, to the extent that we take precedence over wealth as well. So therefore, there is nothing which says that you cannot actually say that you don't want to be resuscitated. No, but you should try every means to ensure that you are able to preserve your life. It will be painful for everybody to see their loved ones suffer, but at the same time, we have faith in God that He is the main person who will be able to alleviate the pain. And there is every reason why we should be praying to the Almighty. Almighty, please make this particular person's end of life that much easier for her. Free them from pain. This is what we can ask. But in any form of assisted suicide will not be acceptable. And to ask a physician or any doctor to take part in that will, in our religious term, will be classified as helping somebody, aiding and abetting somebody to commit suicide, which once again is not acceptable in our religion. It is therefore, from my particular aspect of it, very clear that as far as assisted dying is concerned, we do not believe in assisted dying at all. And we also believe that what they are proposing at this moment in time, there has not been enough views taken from across the communities to understand what this assisted dying really means. And I think there needs to be a wider consultation amongst the minority ethnic communities to better understand what the law would mean if this became a legal way for an assisted dying. So therefore, from both the BIMA, being British Islamic Medical Association, they themselves did a lot of research. and they found themselves that not adequate consultation has been done with this particular group. And they themselves also feel very strongly that this is something which we as BIMA, Muslim community, cannot support, the legalization of assisted dying. Everybody has a choice. I've truly accepted. But if you have a faith in a religious aspect of it, then at that particular space, we cannot accept assisted dying. For me, my life as a personal person, I believe in my religion very strongly. And therefore, and there are lots of people in the Muslim community who are like me, who believe very strongly about our religious beliefs. And we will follow the doctrine which has been sent in the Quran. And this is something which we will always adhere to. Life is limited. We've been told, we've been instructed every aspect of how we should live our life. And this assisted dying is not one of them. And therefore, from a Muslim perspective, we will not be able to support that particular legal bill if we are asked to do so. We live in a country which is free, but at the same time, we also believe that every person has the choice to live a life and be at end of life, have a dignified death. And there should not be a person who should be able to speed up that particular process. And for me, I will end on this to say that assisted dying and assisted suicide is not something in the Muslim perspective that we can accept. Thank you very much indeed.
So thank you very much, Mohammed Omar. And now lastly, can I invite Professor Daniel Solmesi to speak to us.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Moshe and Mohammed, for your very erudite remarks. I'm going to be very American and physician-like and use some slides. I hope that everyone is able to see these now. I have a title for the moments that I have with you that is "The Syringe Belongs in the Hand of a Physician, Power, Authority, Control, and Euthanasia." I'll start with this gentleman, Victor Brock, who was the administrator of the Nazi medical euthanasia program, which preceded the concentration camps. This program killed large numbers of psychiatrically and developmentally ill Germans way before the concentration camps began. It's called T4 for Tiergartenstrasse 4, the street on which the headquarters was located. And Brock's was the administrator, and his motto was "The syringe belongs in the hand of a physician." Euthanasia was, as David suggested, sometimes literally done by an intracardiac injection of phenol by a physician, but it was more often done by gas. It was usually actually done by others, but always medically supervised. And in this sense, metaphorically at least, the syringe was always in the hand of the physician. It's an evocative phrase, sounds very plausible. I find it in some ways sort of chilling when we talk about it in relationship to euthanasia. And so I want to explore a little bit about what it might have meant then and what it might mean for us today. I want to explore with you really in some ways the form of thinking that permitted physicians in Nazi Germany to conduct the T4 program and to go beyond that. And it begins with the idea that really is deep in Western culture over the last few centuries. With the advent of modern science, maybe we can trace it to Bacon, the idea that knowledge is power, that medicine more and more gained knowledge that was very powerful. If you read a book like Bacon's The History of Life and Death, medicine's power was thought to be to stave off death, and that doctors would control bodies through the power of their scientific knowledge. That may seem strange to you, but if you think about it, this, I think, is the way we think today about medicine, whether we're patients or physicians. The objective of the patient is now also to control the body, their own body. And the way it works is that they authorize the physician to use the power of medical knowledge to control their bodies. So it's now a joint undertaking in control of the body that's in some ways the heart of the way we think, although not always consciously, about medicine. And if you don't believe me, this is the way drug companies know how to market medicines to doctors. This is an advertisement for warfarin, the brand name Coumadin. It will give you mastery, which is the ultimate expression of yourself. Now, an instructive way to think about this today, I think, comes from Martin Heidegger. If you'll forgive me, the irony notwithstanding that a Nazi sympathizer could be used in a talk to criticize Nazi thinking, but he was a good philosopher. And particularly his very famous essay, The Question Concerning Technology, I think can be instructive for us. In that essay, he distinguished between an older form of technology that he called poiesis, in which, if we apply it to medicine, we could think about the doctor as calling forth the body's own healing capacities. So the way a Hippocratic doctor worked was to adjust the humors in the body to call forth the healing potential that was already within the body. And this was the way, Heidegger says, most previous technologies before the modern era worked. But the new forms of technology that began perhaps even in the late 18th century, certainly by the late 19th century, and strongly by the beginning of the 20th century, were of a different sort, in which the doctor, we would say, if we apply this to medicine, commands the body, bending it to the joint will of the patient and the physician. And Heidegger talks about the way in which we are embedded in a way of thinking, what he called a Gestell, or in framing, in which we implicitly assume that this is the way things work. The body, for many of us, has now come to be considered what Heidegger suggested all of the earth had become for the modern technological mind. Manipulable stuff. And we've introduced a new kind of dualism in which the patient has become a kind of disembodied source of preferences, owning and commanding that body with the doctor. And we are all embedded in this kind of way of thinking about medicine and about ourselves and our own bodies. Now, German medicine before the Nazis was also in many ways at the forefront of this Gestell. The Germans in the early 20th centuries were the models of scientific medicine. Think of names like Virchow in pathology, Koch in terms of bacteriology and infectious diseases. They were the progressives of the world in terms of medicine. People went from the United States and the UK to Germany to learn medicine at its peak. They were the leaders in genetics, leaders in eugenics. They began by the mid or the 30s to think that they had actually, though fallen behind, taught the Americans and the British too well, and they were falling behind in terms of, for instance, things like sterilization of quote unquote genetically defective individuals. So they were already in many ways embodied in, embedded in the technomedical Gestell. introduced to this than Nazi medical philosophy. And there were ways in which Hitler wrote about and thought about medicine, and it was part of the philosophy of Nazism, that they began to emphasize prevention over the care of the sick. Vorsorgen over Fürsorgen. And the world's first textbook of medical ethics was actually written by a Nazi physician. The Nazis were the first country in the world to require medical ethics, if you want to put scare quotes around that, teaching in medical schools. Ärztliche Rechts- und Standeskunde, der Arzt als Gesundheitsseher, the physician as a health guide or coach or leader. The emphasis on in Nazi medicine was on prevention and on population medicine, something that ought to make us a little nervous, perhaps with our move in that way, to control not of just the body of the individual patient, but the control of populations of patients. Jay Lifton has suggested that National Socialism was nothing else but politics as applied biology or a biocracy. There were more physicians who joined the Nazi Party than any other profession in Germany. They were at the forefront of Nazism because it gave these ideas that they had had for years before the Nazis of eugenics and this technomedical Gestell, a way of making it the realm's way of thinking. And Germany then shot to the forefront of eugenic sterilizations. They were praised for this in publications like the Journal of the American Medical Association. And the upshot of this is an important take-home message for everyone, is that Hitler did not impose a eugenic and racist agenda on medicine. What he did rather was to empower physicians to carry out their own long-standing prior agenda. He gave them control over patients' bodies, but also began to empower them in terms of social policy as well. And here's what Rahm says in his textbook on euthanasia. It is the task of the physician to be pioneering in regard to these ideas. It is the task of the state to give it the force of law. Medicine leads. All the Nazis do is give them the chance to take it to its extremes, most extreme measures. How does this get instantiated? I'll give you another example of a Nazi physician, Imfried Eberl, was a psychiatrist who joined the Nazi Party as a medical student, went on to become an SS member and the medical director of the T4 euthanasia program, again, for psychiatrically ill patients and developmentally disabled patients at a place called Bernburg, sort of southwest of Berlin. Now, this is a picture of the gas chamber in Bernburg. Bernburg, I can tell you, is still an active psychiatric hospital. It never stopped being an active psychiatric hospital. This is in the basement, and upstairs they are prescribing Prozac. Now, I've been to Auschwitz, I've been to Birkenau, I've been to Theresienstadt, I've been to Sachsenhausen, but nothing was more chilling for me as a physician than to see a gas chamber in a hospital, particularly one that is still actively treating patients. This is where the gas chambers began. Physicians were euthanizing larger numbers of patients than they could do by individual injection, using initially carbon monoxide in gas chambers in hospitals. And here's the connection between medicine and the final solution. You've got to put yourself into the weird strangeness of Nazi thinking. They thought they were wasting ammunition by shooting Jews out in the East. The soldiers were actually getting squeamish about shooting large numbers of unarmed non-combatants. And this presented a problem for them. So they began to question, who knows how to kill large numbers of people quietly? The answer? Physicians. They know how to do it. They've already been doing it in the T4 program. And so Imfried Eberl was sent from Bernburg to create the first gas chamber in Treblinka. Again, Hitler did not invent the gas chambers. Physicians invented gas chambers. Now, what does this have to do with medicine today? Certainly, that's a chilling story that I just told you. But we share the Baconian dream of forestalling death. As I said before, I think control of the body has become our central theme. And we are embedded in the techno-medical gestalt. The body for us is still enframed as standing, reserved to be controlled. Now, what happens, if that's the way you think, when you face the limit of control, when you experience finitude, which is at root an experience of suffering? Well, what cannot be controlled makes no sense when the only sense that can be made is to be in control. And what cannot be controlled in this totalizing schema then becomes senseless suffering, and it is intolerable, unacceptable, or unbearable. And what happens then is that what cannot be controlled must therefore be eliminated. What cannot be controlled must be eliminated because it is unacceptable to think we cannot be in control. The central issue then and now in assisted suicide and euthanasia is control. It's not autonomy. If you ask patients in surveys, and David alluded to this, why did you autonomously choose physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia? The answer is loss of independence, loss of control, the helplessness of waiting for death, dependence upon others. It's loss of control. It's not intractable symptoms that leads patients to move towards assisted suicide or euthanasia, because that lack of control is judged to be intolerable. Physicians come at it from the same perspective. It is very difficult for them to accept the limits of medicine when they cannot control every aspect of the patient's suffering. A quote from a survey, it's an awful thing to come to the patient with your bag of tricks empty. And this lack of control for us as physicians in the techno-medical gestalt, which is all about control, also becomes intolerable. What are the problems that this introduces? Well, if autonomy is not the issue, it isn't, because it's whether it's authorized by a deity or the state or the patient, the issue is control. Even autonomy gets subverted by the techno-medical gestalt. Patients, I think, merely internalize the worthlessness that the doctors and the rest of us see in them and play it back to us as what seems to be an autonomous request. And we even try to measure the subjective suffering of the patient, which seems to me to be quite bizarre, making it objective somehow. Second, the control that is being fostered here is actually illusory, right? Death still wins. If it seems intolerable that we can't control death, I'm going to kill you instead. That's a little bit ironic, I think. The dualism that is introduced by this techno-medical gestalt is also false. There is no ghostly person separate from and controlling the body. We are embodied persons. Good medicine must in fact accept limits and be humble. As Hippocrates put it, when the patient is overmastered by disease, desist because medicine is powerless. So allowing patients to die is perfectly compatible with that form of medicine. It accepts the limits and steps back. But assisted suicide and euthanasia represent a refusal to accept those limits, a refusal to accept that we cannot control what is in fact uncontrollable. And the looming danger, the real looming danger, is the marriage of totalizing medicine and the totalitarian state. Because both are fixed on control and both strive to eliminate what cannot be controlled, right? The totalitarian state takes the dissident and puts them in jail or executes them, right? It's the population that must be controlled. For medicine, it's the individual body. Marry those two together and we're in real trouble. That's what happened in Nazi Germany. And the chances of putting those two things together are not so remote, not so remote. It is possible, I hope it is, for us to see this clearly enough to be able to practice humble medicine, mindful of our limits, through things like palliative care, promote acceptance by patients of the idea that some aspects are beyond control, help them to find sources of self-worth other than control, and eliminate their symptoms, but not eliminate them. I think it's possible for us to reject the dualism that's implicit in this technomedical gestalt, which we think our own bodies are just stuff to be manipulated instead of just being us. And I think we can seek a proper relationship between profession, state, market, and academy so that a wise physician will not seek the power of the death-dealing syringe or the prescribing pen, and a wise society will not place it in the physician's hand. But we ought never believe that medicine is incapable of doing this again. I think the story of Nazi medicine is a call to remain vigilant and be careful. So thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you so much, Professor Salmasi. And we now have a time of questions. So if you have any questions, please direct them in the chat to David Katz. You should be able to see David Katz in your chat box, and send a question to him, and he will chair questions for the panel.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to all the speakers for providing such expert overviews of complicated subjects in a way that's been very, very accessible and very, very informative. We already have one question that's come up immediately, which is a question relating to fact. And I want to put it to Mohammed. The question is that, were you suggesting that Muslims may be suspicious or cautious of do not resuscitate orders in hospitals and indeed by patients?
Thank you, David. No, we're not suspicious of that at all. I think it's a choice, and we just have to make sure that it's an informed choice and it's based on our religious requirements, whereby it depends on what level. There are some issues whereby do not resuscitate is perfectly allowable, and in certain cases it's not allowable. But that is where it is. It's not, we're not suspicious in any respect that the government or the hospital are trying to deliberately push do not resuscitate. But I'm just saying is the fact that there are instances whereby if you are in that particular position and you don't want to be resuscitated, it is permissible in certain circumstances.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mohammed. And now there is a question which was partly raised by David, but also by, to a certain extent, by Daniel. It's the question of, there was in your comments a competitive eugenics, competitive nationalism of eugenics between different countries vying for their ability to actually achieve the eugenic objectives. I'm interested to hear your views about what you feel about the comparative attitude to introduction of physician-assisted suicide and of euthanasia. Are we living through a period where there's a similar kind of competitive scheme, the different states in the United States, the different countries in Europe? And is this actually part of the danger, if you like, or the risk of the current debate in the UK?
Shall I go first? One thing which strikes me is that despite the sense that one sometimes has in discussions of this in the media, is actually how slow this change has been. That the Voluntary Euthanasia Legalization Society started in 1935. And up until the end of the 20th century, there were still only 3 jurisdictions in the world, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Oregon that had it. And now we have some states in the United States, but a minority. Some states in the EU, but a minority. Some states in the UN, but a minority. Where we've had very large social changes in relation to marriage and in relation to contraception and abortion and reproductive attitudes to reproduction. In this, there has been caution, and I think there has, and it's good that there has been caution. So I don't think it necessarily is the case, but for some countries, I think it is the case, and unfortunately, politically, it's been painted as similar to other things, similar to homosexual marriage, or similar to liberalization of abortion, and something which you ought to be in favor of if you're liberal, and you need, and then you show your virtue signal. And this isn't just a problem for this issue, this is a problem for other issues, that instead of thinking about issues one at a time, you put them all in a bucket, and they're either one thing or they're another. And I think that some countries have tried to push as far as possible, and I see this in Canada. What's happened in Canada has been so rapid. The number of deaths in Canada now has overtaken those in the Netherlands. Thousands of people are being euthanized in Canada, and any concern about limits, any concern about conscientious objection is being suppressed with a strong sense of pride that they're out competing in this way. So in some countries it has got like that, but I don't think it necessarily is the case. It doesn't need to be the case, and I think that it's really important that we try to separate out different issues and say, well, just look at this for what it is, and say, is it a good idea or not? But there are some countries where they take pride in how quickly they're going, and they're going more quickly than anyone else. And I fear that Canada is in that category.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think it's very useful to point out that most countries in the world have not adopted this, and that it has been very slow at a sort of level of whether a nation or a state adopts it. But I think you're also right, David, that once a country does adopt it, there has been this sort of pattern of, we're going to do a better job of it than the previous country that did it, right? And there's that sort of competitive sense. And I think you saw some of that in Belgium with respect to the Netherlands, and I think you see, as you pointed out, Canada doing that with respect to the Low Countries as well. We're going to do it better. And part of that is also still, I think, part of the way technology works, right? The technomedical gestalt. Once a procedure it becomes permitted in medicine, no matter what it is, we have what's called indication creep, right? So what you do is more and more people become eligible for the procedure when you thought it was only going to be available for a certain number of people. And I think you just see that happening in spades in places like Belgium and Canada, in which, well, if it's okay if you're terminally ill, isn't that harming people who are equally suffering but are not terminally ill? So we should have psychiatrically ill patients or patients with chronic diseases eligible. And what happens to people who can't say that they want it? And we move to persons who are demented or unable to speak for themselves, with the family saying, oh, they would have wanted it if they were able to speak for us. And so the number of persons who are eligible for it begins to increase. And some of those pressures are just internal to medicine and internal to our technological way of thinking.
And can I also say something which is indirectly related to that, but something which really struck me very strongly from Professor Salmasi's talk was it's about control and not autonomy, is the irony that I have often thought of in relation to euthanasia or assisted suicide. So there are some countries that only allow assisted suicide, so you have to take the poison yourself, and some which allow both euthanasia and assisted suicide. And when you have the choice, overwhelmingly, people don't want to do it themselves. They want the doctor to do it. So Canada, out of 6,000 cases or so almost 7,000 cases in 2019, 7 were self-administered. 7 out of 7,000. And that's because by handing it over, you feel safer because the doctor's in control.
The syringe belongs in the hand of the physician.
And it is really striking that it isn't actually about autonomy. It is about feeling safe because the doctor's in control. And this is a pattern across all countries that have them both, that if you give the people a choice, then in the end, they don't want to do it themselves. They want to feel safe in the hands of the doctor.
There's an interesting question was raised, which I think has been partly answered by Daniel, was that the thought has been expressed that it was a particularly chilling exposition on the subject. But the concern is that it was only at the latter part, at the end, when it became clear that he appeared to be totally against the idea. Daniel, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I guess I'm trying to be objective in laying out what the logic was, and so yes, if I didn't display my hand, it was just to sort of say this is the underlying logic. If you think there's a problem with that logic, I'm in total agreement with you. But I wanted to lay out what I think the underlying form of thinking is that leads to this.
There is one element which follows on from that, which is the element of one of the issues in the UK is the suggestion of the fact that you will have to have lawyers participating in making decisions, final decisions. But what is the position, in your view, about the role of the doctor as the expert who that lawyer is going to consult? What is the status of those doctors when, if you like, they're going to be handling the needle, but they're going to actually also be handling the evidence that goes towards the hanging judge, if you like?
Yes, well, I don't think that anybody is in a particular position to judge what is, in an objective way, what is intolerable suffering, right? Let alone a physician. I mean, we don't have any sort of expertise in doing that. I don't think anybody else does either. But yet, that's the odd position that the physician is put in. And in point of fact, what simply happens is then, at least as it turns out in the United States, and I suspect in other countries as well, is that there is no questioning, because the patient says, I'm suffering, and the patient says, it's intolerable. Who's to say anything different? And physicians very rarely refuse, even in the Netherlands, when they're put to that. And they have no basis for doing so if they do, because both the concept of suffering and the concept of what's intolerable are subjective and belong to the patient. And it's a reason that I think once this is there, that it simply can't be controlled.
Right. I mean, the one issue was raised about the renal patients and the question of refusal of dialysis. Would you like to amplify a little bit about that? Because that appears to be a particularly sinister side issue, if you like.
Thank you, Professor Katz. Yeah, I mean, this was something that I was alerted to by a professor of nephrology who had seen this paper quite recently, but it does appear to be more of a trend. Now, the paper doesn't cite this connection unequivocally. It is a link. I'm sure that there is more to discuss, because I think that it's difficult to unpick the reasons of why the numbers are going up so much in terms of dialysis withdrawal, particularly in the Netherlands. But they did cite this as a possibility, and the very fact that it was cited as a possibility shows that they're thinking about whether the very liberal views, liberal quote unquote, the permissive views of euthanasia and assisted suicide in the Netherlands is a motivating factor, because it would stand to reason that society is changed by our attitudes to life, and when the law permits something like euthanasia or assisted suicide, it changes our attitudes to life. It cheapens life. There is a paradigm shift in society on the way that you view the sick and the elderly and those with illnesses. And some people might say, well, that's great. You know, we're putting the patients in control. They're getting to choose for themselves, that, you know, they don't have to suffer. They don't have to treat themselves. They can allow nature to take its course. You know, to me, this is a huge red flag of what I said before about the law of unintended consequences, which is very often, you know, even more than the slippery slope argument. I think the law of unintended consequences is, you know, to me, a huge concern when it comes to the idea of allowing euthanasia and assisted suicide in society. It's the effect it has on the culture and the way of thinking, the mode of thinking, the attitudes that we have to life itself, which I think are going to be seriously under threat. And I think that is an incredibly worrying trend.
Thank you very much, and raising several issues. One of the issues that's been brought to the fore in this country is the question of vulnerability, question of inequalities. Is there any discussion about the inequalities in society impacting on physician-assisted suicide? For example, when you're less affluent, or when you're less able to go out into a safe environment because of financial reasons, is that impacting in other countries on these issues? Maybe Daniel, if you comment on maybe in the United States, that might be considered.
Sure, at least in the United States, I can say that minorities are, for the most part, extremely reticent to take this up, and poor people are very underrepresented among those who take on assisted suicide. Again, I think it's more of an indication of the centrality of control as the issue. It's the person who is actually, psychological studies have shown that people who have what's called a dismissive personality type, who are sort of have lifelong obsessions with issues of control and difficulties with relationships, are the most likely to seek and to carry out assisted suicide in the United States. And they tend to be very successful people, right? They're in charge of corporations, they're in charge of lots of other people and used to being in control, and that's the issue for them. But minorities and poor people have tended not to use it in the United States, and in many cases to be fearful of it. The disabled community especially has been very troubled by these trends and very worried about it. And I think, again, it's not because they think that they are going to be lined up in their wheelchairs and forcefully injected tomorrow, but I think it is the very idea that the state and medicine sanction dependence upon other people as being a sufficient reason to die, to make your life not worth living, that the mere fact that it's legalized is an assault on the dignity of every person who is disabled and depends upon other people for their activities of daily living every day.
And I just might add to that in relation to very successful people who are used to being in control, and so they don't count as vulnerable in one way, but they, in another way, it makes them vulnerable. And in particular, that's why men more than women at retirement who have been very successful are also vulnerable to suicide, to non-assisted suicide, because they are less able to cope with not having the degree of control that they are used to having. So, and it's one way in which, though people sometimes wish to separate them very strongly, assisted suicide and suicide, there is an overlap. There are things in common, and one of the things in common is that some people who are in other ways successful and in other ways don't look vulnerable might actually be vulnerable in this way. And I mean, this to think about, you know, people you know and so on. It's the vulnerability. The vulnerability is not just about socioeconomic things.
Right. I mean, one of the issues that Daniel, your image of the psychiatric hospital resonated, because presumably psychiatric patients are a particularly vulnerable group in this context. And one is brought to mind the issues about the questions of psychiatric hospitals in the former Soviet Union and the way they have had to adapt to changes in psychiatric practices, which is actually very extremely disturbing. I wonder if you'd care to comment more about that.
Two things that might be said. One is that, yes, Soviet psychiatry is exactly another example of totalizing medicine and the totalitarian state coming together, right? So medicine is then used to control the dissident, right, as an agent of the state, and so again, those who naively think that we are incapable of doing this and that we've learned our lesson and we have nothing to do with what happened in Nazi Germany, I think are just naive, and we need to be vigilant about these possibilities. The second is the vulnerabilities of psychiatric patients are very real. I very much appreciate what David said about the person in control also being vulnerable in their own way because of their concern for being in control. And it just reminded me that a Jesuit psychiatrist who worked for many years at one of Harvard's teaching hospitals. The Massachusetts General Hospital was named Ned Kassem. And he used to always emphasize that the person who says, I am thinking about suicide, is quite often testing the waters. What they want to do is see if somebody is willing to say to them, you shouldn't do that. You are worth too much to me, to everybody who loves you, to the world, to do that. And what they fear is the answer that legalization gives them. Sure, go ahead, it's okay, right? And that again becomes a troubling way in which, David and his colleague David Patton have shown, at least in the United States, that jurisdictions in which assisted suicide has been legalized also actually have a concomitant increase in the rate of suicide in the general population. And it may be because of this sort of more global general acceptance that suicide is okay under certain circumstances. And that is very dangerous for people who are vulnerable.
Mohammed, you?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to just touch upon the previous one. In terms of inequality in health is a concern for everybody for certain areas, and it was very demonstrable. And I'm sure Professor Katz, you will agree with me, during the COVID pandemic, you saw some of the inequalities in health contributed to the higher levels of death in certain communities and certain deprived areas. So that obviously, as Daniel has said, may lead to people not having access to proper medical care to think about the suicide aspect of it as well. But I think what most importantly worries me, and what Moshe has also done, is how much are we valuing a life? Are we trying to put a price on a life? And sometimes when they are, one of the arguments which has been submitted for assisted suicide is the cost, to try and save costs, to say, well, is it worthwhile looking after this patient and what's going to cost me? So are you actually valuing, and you know how to value the life of a person? Surely as a society today, we should be a caring society. We should be investing more to palliative care. We are longer living because of science, a bit of better medication. That is why people are having a longer life. So surely as a country, we should be investing more in palliative care and giving equalities in health, and not valuing somebody's life to say that, listen, he's not worth surviving, he's not worth it. No, this has been determined by the Almighty. And I don't think we should be interfering in what is the natural course. That would be my comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohammed. And I think that we've now given our speakers a fair grilling about the things that they've said already. Before I hand you back to David, I don't know whether any of the Moshe, Mohammed, or Daniel want to make any further comments that they feel may need to be said. Any comments? Moshe?
I think that all of the things that have been said this evening have been really valuable. I've learned a lot. I think, as I said before, one has to be very careful not to view this simply as a debate. These are real lives that we're speaking about. There are real people out there who are suffering. And as painful as that is, we have to recognize that no set of laws in society is going to be perfect. Medicine is not perfect, and human beings are not perfect. All of those things are imperfect, and we've kind of gotten used to thinking, as Professor Solmesi intimated before, that this is all about, this is more about control rather than autonomy. We're used to thinking that we can be in control of everything. And I think allowing ourselves to recognize the imperfections that we have in those arenas of law, of medicine, and of humanity, and recognizing that we can't control everything. We have to allow ourselves to recognize the very fact that we are going to die, and we will not necessarily have control over how we die or when we die. It's quite a sobering thought, but it links beautifully into the concept of faith in religion, that we have to have a little bit of faith inside of us to recognize that, particularly if we are of a religious, a faith tradition and a religious persuasion, that God is in control, and that faith and trust in God has to come through. It's a difficult one to sell to wider society, but I think from my perspective, that's quite comforting to me. I hope it's comforting to others as well.
Mohammed?
Thanks, Moshe. I think what you've said is exactly resonates with myself. But what I would really like to say is that I think Daniel Salmasi, you surmised it so beautifully to say that when medicine cannot cure a disease, they decide to take that. How can we control somebody's life? They should simply accept that not every disease can be cured by medicine itself, right? And you see so many patients in in my experience, and I'm sure Moshe has also seen in his experience, when people are at that level, they have faith. The only thing which is keeping them going is their faith. And if you take that away, really, that's not from a faith perspective, gives us a lot of comfort. And that is why when you're at end of life, you see specifically from persons of faith, they would want somebody, either an imam or a rabbi or a reverend, to be there to comfort them, because they've got that hope that faith will be able to cure them. And there have been cases where God has determined, and they have survived miraculously. No answer can be given by the medics or anything. How did this person survive or get out of this particular treatment? And that is reality. And I don't understand that. I know that wider society may not all believe in faith, but certainly from my personal perspective, just like Moshe, I have some comfort that when I'm going through pain or anything, I have my full faith in the Almighty.
And Daniel, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
I think I spoke enough. I'm just grateful to be able to listen to people like Moshe and Mohammed and both Davids. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hand you back to David Jones.
Thank you very much. I noticed a hand up by someone who is Dana's Buddhist chaplain. Were you wanting to make a comment, Mariano?
Yeah, and it is a bit late in the day, but there is an important issue that people can take away anyway with them. When I raised the issue of the natural death and the decision by the patient not to carry on with intrusive procedures and so on, that kind of issue, well, that is a specific one, but technology is changing constantly all the time. Yeah, and there is a cost to it as well. And what kind of life as well? A vegetative life, or there is an issue which cannot be swept under the carpet. Yeah, we need to pluck up some courage and start thinking about it, because it will become more and more relevant. Yeah, natural death, technology allows us going forth to do quite a lot of things. Where do you draw a line? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. So, I mean, some of which I think perhaps relates to what's Professor Salmasi was saying, and I think there's a kind of irony here that technology is driven by this desire for control, but then people become fearful of what technology has produced. So one of the things that people are afraid of in relation to that end of life is that they won't be supported in, as you say, a natural death, a death which seems to come in a natural way, but that technology will add to their burdens and become an extra kind of thing. and this may also be a flip side of this question about how to be humble, how medicine can be humble, and this is I think an important part of palliative care, an important part of medicine. So thank you for introducing it. I've been struck by the similarity, the commonality of view that we've heard tonight. One that isn't common simply by being the lowest common denominator, not common simply by being secular, but is a common religious vision, but also which has something to say to wider society in terms of the value of the person, and also a faith which will allow acknowledgement of lack of control, and acknowledgement of the reality of death. If I can give a plug, the center, the Anscombe Bioethics Centre, which is www.bioethics.org.uk. We have a series of briefing papers which we produced on euthanasia and assisted suicide, one which is ongoing, and the latest, which went up, I think, just over an hour and a half ago, is a paper which is about the common Abrahamic position, a common position between Jews and Christians and Muslims on principles of end of life. This position paper, which was suggested to the Pope by Rabbi Avram Steinberg, who had been invited by the Pope to become a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life. And the initiative itself was, I think, an excellent interfaith initiative, and that's why we were keen to also promote it more by putting it on our website. So I think that it also gives me hope to see members of different faith communities working together, talking together about matters which are serious and challenging, for the sake of the wider community, not simply looking inward, but also looking outward, but looking outward from their own faith traditions, and that's certainly one of the things that I have taken from this week. So I think at this stage, perhaps if I invite Father Philip Miller, who is the chaplain to all of the universities of Westminster Diocese, which is not quite the same as all of the universities of London, a bit more and a bit less, and who has been very supportive in this in the initiative for this event, to end with some final reflections. Father Philip.
Thank you, Professor Jones. Yes, I felt as this evening's progressed an immense privilege, really, in being able, myself and Newman House here, to host and make some of the arrangements for this conference. As we all know, this topic of assisted dying, assisted suicide, euthanasia is extremely pertinent to this precise moment in British history, this month or so, past month. And we saw in the recent debate in the House of Lords the huge number of speakers, extremely high number of speakers wanting to contribute to that discussion of the Meacher Bill. And I think it was around about 60 of those who did speak in the debate were absolutely in defense of life, warning strongly the harm of legalizing any form of assisted dying. And I presume it was the strength of feeling of those speakers that perhaps warded off a vote on that particular evening in the House. I know that when I was in correspondence myself with various lords in the run-up to the debate, one of the lords replied to me by email rather bluntly and said, "I note that everyone who's written to me on this topic is a person of faith." He said it obviously in a rather sarcastic way, but my reaction, of course, was, well, yes, of course. it's obvious that people of faith are going to be encouraged to engage in, and rightly so, in this debate. We know that our faith traditions strongly urge us to the upholding of the sanctity of life, human life, even in the challenges of old age, sickness, and suffering. And I would suggest, echoing Professor Jones there, it's a matter of immense encouragement that this evening we've been able to approach this in an interfaith way. But we also know that the proper care for the human person, howsoever afflicted, is dear to the hearts of all, those of faith and those of none. And we've heard over the past hour and a half or so, I would say, a powerful series of contributions to this debate. And as the host of this conference here at the Catholic Chaplaincy to London's universities, I'd like to particularly extend our thanks then to those speakers this evening, to Professor Jones, to Professor David Jones, to Rabbi Dr. Moshe Friedman, to Mohammed Omar, MBE, to Professor Daniel Surmezi, and to Professor David Katz for really anchoring this evening and providing a lot of food for thought and to benefit our thinking and our clarity on these issues. They've given us a really broad approach, I think, this evening, and we thank them for taking the time they have to share their learning, expertise, and experience with us at the forefront of caring for the sick, which of course is a matter that sometime or another is bound to reach into and touch all our lives profoundly. Issues of sickness and death and touch us all one day. I thank all of those who've participated this evening, all of those who've attended this evening, joined us for this evening conference online, and I hope that you've benefited from the speakers' contributions and the discussion which has followed. Thank you. Good night. God bless.